MUstudent.com, and today we are going to learn about transactions. In the previous tutorial we learned about batch statements, and we learned that the difference was that with some statements, if you do like a regular non-batch statement, you will be sending every single one of your either insert or update SQL statements to a database individually, and it will be causing a lot of traffic and you'll get a lot of backup. But if you're doing a lot of inserts and a lot of update statements, what you can do is you can do what's called a batch statement, which would hold them all together, and then whenever you are ready to send that information, it would send it as one batch, so it would only talk to the database once, and then it would do all of the information on the other side. But one of the things I hinted to at the end of the last tutorial was that our program wasn't very good, because we had one major problem. And what we had was we had a withdraw from the checking account and we had a deposit into the savings account. So we said that we wanted to take out $100 and put in $100 to another account. And we had this simple thing here. But what I told you guys was, what would happen if there was an error in the deposit into savings? Let's say there was some kind of SQL error. What would happen is, if this was an ATM, it would still take out the withdraw from checking, because that was the first statement. So it would take that out, and then it would batch it, and then it would take out the deposit into savings. It would take it out and it would batch it. But then when it went to the database, if there was an error during this deposit, it would carry out the withdraw, so it would take out the $100, but then it would not put back in the $100 because there was an error. So the problem would be the person's money would just be lost in cyberspace. It would be a horrible, horrible occurrence, and you would get sued, and who knows what would happen from there. So what I told you was, what we need to implement is a way so that the withdraw from checking and the deposit into savings are somehow linked in a transaction, so that if the withdraw from checking and the deposit into savings, if they both work, then they should both be implemented into the database. But if either one of these do not work, then the database will roll back, he'll take out all the things that he previously did, and he won't commit any of those statements. So then we would just show a prompt to the user and say, oh my God, we're sorry, the $100 that you put in worked, but we weren't able to put the next $100 into your deposit account, and we're sorry, and you're going to have to try again later, instead of just losing their information into cyberspace. So if we look at these diagrams, look at the next one. Here we have the database processing the batch. So let's say that we sent 4 statements into the batch. What would happen is, say this is an insert statement, this is an insert statement, this is one, and this is one. After it's sent over from the program into the database, then the database will implement all of those SQL statements. So that's what I have here, the database implementing these 4 statements. But imagine if this one didn't work. What would happen is, he would do this one first, he would do this one, he would skip this one because it didn't work in the batch, and then he would do this one. So this one would just be skipped. So say if this was putting $100 more into the person's account, it just wouldn't happen. A really bad problem. So what we want to do is we want to make a transaction so that if all of the statements work, all of them are implemented. But if one of them does not work, if one of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, or 4 of them do not work, then none of them get implemented. So here would be a positive transaction. It would say, commit all the statements. They all work, do them. But if it's a bad one, then don't do anything. So let's look at this final diagram before we get to the code. Basically, this is steps for making a transaction. So what you want to do in the beginning is you want to set auto commit to false. So what that is saying is, auto commit would say, it would be this this diagram, and he would say, do this, do this, do this, do this, just keep doing things. But you want to set auto commit to false, and then you want to check if there are any errors. So you set auto commit to false, and you say, don't just do everything the second you see it. So you set it to false, don't do everything, and then in here we're checking all of our errors. If there are no errors, then commit all of the statements. If there is an error, then I want you to roll back all of the statements and don't do anything. And believe it or not, this is actually extremely easy to implement in the code. The harder thing is to make you understand when you would ever want to do this. So you basically make a transaction whenever you want all of your statements to be like an atomic shell. So it's like an atomic bomb. Either it all goes off or nothing happens. You either want everything to happen or you want nothing to happen. So if you ever have a case where you want that scenario to take place, then you need to think transaction. So this is actually really easy to implement. I knew I'd be talking way more than we would be coding. So as you saw in the beginning, I said the first step is you want to set auto commit to false. So you don't want it to just do everything that it says. So in order to set auto commit to false, you come right after connection, after you make the connection. So right at the top, so this is the same program we were working on in the bank account. So right after you make the connection to the database, after this, do me a favor and type this: connection dot set auto commit. And as you can see from here, you could put a Boolean value in here. So you can either put true, so that would mean do all of these statements, do the auto commit, and that's what it is by default. Or you can put false, and you can say don't do anything until I tell you to commit. So type in here false. So this line right here is saying with this connection that we've established, I want you to check all the errors. Don't do anything if there is one-to-many invalid statements. And I want you to commit everything if everything is valid. So that is what this is doing. It's saying don't do anything until I tell you to commit. So now what we want to do is we have two catch blocks in here. We don't need two catch blocks anymore. And I want you to do, as you can see, what we have now is we have very specific catch blocks. And we're saying if you have a class not found exception from the driver manager, print out this. If you have an SQL exception from any of these SQL statements, do this. What I want you to do is take out the SQL exception. And you're going to see red squigglies all over the place because they're going to say you need to put in an SQL exception. But what I want you to do is instead of making two very specific catch blocks, we're going to make one extremely generic catch block, the most generic one you can make. And it's called exception. So you're saying if any exception happens in this try block, and then print it out here. And then what we need to do is if an error happens, we want to roll back the entire connection. So if you have any error here, we want to roll back the entire connection. So the way you do that is right in this catch block for exception, write down connection dot roll back, and then give me a semicolon. And that's going to give you an error. But before we discuss the error, what we did was we set auto commit to false, and then we said if there's ever a problem, I want you to roll back the exception. Now, the problem with this statement is this statement also throws an exception. It throws an SQL exception because as we've talked about, every single time you want to do anything with the database, you need to expect an SQL exception. So since this is in a catch block already, we can't put another catch block around this. So, I mean, maybe we could do like a try catch in there, but it would just get ridiculous. So what you can do is all you need to do is add a throws exception to your main method. So if you do throws SQL exception, this would say if this also is an error, then it will print out into the console whatever the error is for you. Kind of like what we were doing with the exceptions already. If we caught an exception, we printed it out in the console. So this is saying if there is an exception with this connection rollback, print it out in the console. So now that we've taken out and we've made our exceptions more generic, we can take out this class not found exception. So now we've established the first two parts, the set auto commit to false, and if everything is bad, roll back. If anything, if one-to-many invalid statements. So how do we say if all the statements are valid, we want it to commit? Well, all you have to do is you have to come to the end of your code. Right after it says statement.execute batch, after this, say connection dot commit. So now you're saying if we can get through all this code and there's absolutely no problem with anything, then I want you to commit. I want you to do what we said we were going to do. It's pretty sweet. So if there's any problem, roll everything back. And if there is a problem, then I want you, if there is a problem, roll everything back. And if there's no problem, I want you to commit. So now I want to see this thing in action. So if we look at our SQL database and I click go and I select everything in there, right now I have 500 in my checking and 500 in my savings. And what we have down here is we want to update the bank account and take $100 out of our checking account and put $100 into our savings account. And if it all works, it should print out account modified. So if we print this out, error table YouTube. Oh, okay, 1 second. Oh, okay. I had an SQL exception. Now it says account modified. So let's go in here and I'm going to click go. And as you can see, $400 was taken out of my checking account and $600 was put into, $100 was taken out of my checking account and $100 was put into my savings account. So it works. Now we see all of our code was alright, so it worked. It did what we wanted to do. But now what I want to do is display what would happen if we actually had an error, kind of like what I just did. And if you have an error, theoretically what it should do is it should roll everything back. So if we had an error with the withdraw checking, or if we had an error with the deposit saving, what it should do is it should tell us what the error is, and it should roll back that error. So let's say if our error was what I just had. So let's say if one of these tables, instead of saying bank account, let's say we just said account. So there is no table in our database right now called account. So this should throw an error that will say, hey, you're trying to query a table that you don't have. So if we run this, it will tell us error, this table does not exist. And if we click go, you will see absolutely nothing happened. It didn't commit any of the statements. So we didn't have that effect of what we were scared of in having some of our information lost in cyberspace. But let's see if we actually needed to do it. So let's comment out all the things that we put in and let's see what happens. So if we comment out connection rollback, and we comment out connection commit, and we comment out connection set auto comment to false, and we run this, and we keep our same error in here. So we want to take 100 out of checking, and we want to put 100 into the top deposit, and we run this. It still does the same exact thing it still shows us the same thing. Hey, you had an error, but let's look at what happens when we click go. Right now we're at 400 and 600, and now it goes down to 300, 600. That's the problem. So this person's money would be lost in cyberspace because some dude forgot to say bank before bank account, and now everybody's getting fired because you just got $1 million lawsuit on your hand. So this is the way to make a transaction. This is the whole point of why you would ever want to make a transaction. I hope all of this makes sense to you guys. Again, comment below and let me know if anything did not make sense. I will respond to your comments, I promise, as long as this isn't like 20 years down the road and YouTube is still up and I'm way past this. But as long as it's somewhat recent, I'll try to respond to all of your comments. I really hope that you guys like that I go a little slower and I show you guys descriptions of everything that I want you to understand before we get to the code. But I'm rambling now. But thank you all for watching, and in the next tutorial we're going to go a little deeper and we're going to learn more stuff about JDBC. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next tutorial.